Welcome to Tell Me More Stories Told As podcast. Get ready, because today you're joining us on a gripping journey. It's into a period of history that, while profoundly dark, holds really crucial lessons for all of us. We're talking about the Holocaust.
Hmm.
We're going to delve deep into how this systematic persecution and ultimately murder of European Jews unfolded during World War II.
Yeah, it's a huge and complex topic.
It is. Think of this as us trying to piece together a puzzle of, frankly, unimaginable horror, tracing the steps from the insidious beginnings of discrimination all the way to the abyss of genocide.
And it's important to understand it wasn't just one single event appearing out of nowhere.
Exactly. It's easy to picture the Holocaust as one sudden, monstrous thing, but the truth is it began quite differently. Did you know that in the early days, the Nazi regime's primary aim wasn't actually extermination?
That often surprises people.
Right. They were focused initially on making Jewish people leave Germany, forced emigration.
Uh-huh.
So let's unpack this. Let's see how that initial chilling goal twisted into the horrific reality we now know.
Well, to really grasp that transformation, you have to look at the long and pretty intricate history behind it. Jewish people have been living in Europe for what, over 2,000 years?
2 millennia.
A long time, a very long time. And for centuries, a key element was anti-Semitism rooted in Christian theology. Specifically that accusation, that Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus.
Right, and that created this really deep-seated prejudice across the continent, didn't it?
Absolutely. It had centuries to take root.
And then in the 19th century, you see this significant shift. Many European countries start granting Jew citizenship. What was the thinking there?
Well, the hope, or perhaps the expectation, was assimilation, that they would integrate fully into society.
Okay.
And by the early 20th century, particularly in Central and Western Europe, many Jewish communities had, in fact, become quite integrated, blended into the social fabric.
So not everywhere, you mentioned.
No, definitely not. It's important to remember the situation was, well, quite different in Eastern Europe. There, many Jews continued to live in smaller towns, these shtetls, maintained their Yiddish language, practiced Orthodox Judaism.
So a real spectrum of Jewish experiences across Europe even before all this began.
A wide spectrum, yeah. And it wasn't solely about religious anti-Semitism either.
Right. What else was feeding into it?
Well, the 18th and 19th centuries also saw the rise of political anti-Semitism. This was often closely linked to burgeoning nationalism, the idea of the nation-state.
And the Industrial Revolution, too, economic factors.
Precisely. As nations started defining themselves more exclusively, and as industrialization brought new economic rivalries, no anxieties, Jewish people were frequently scapegoated. And then you also see the disturbing emergence of racist ideologies, this pseudo-scientific notion that humanity could be divided into distinct, unequal races.
And Jews were categorized as what?
As a separate alien racial group within Europe. Fundamentally different, inherently dangerous, baseless justifications for hatred, basically.
It's chilling how those ideas started taking hold. The sources also mention Germany's colonial ventures, like the Herero and Nama genocide in Southwest Africa. How does that connect?
It's a really important and disturbing connection. If you look at the bigger picture, it reveals this developing pattern within German thinking, a dangerous preoccupation with racial purity, with colonial expansion.
Okay.
The incredibly brutal methods used in Southwest Africa, including setting up a kind of racial apartheid. It provided an early, horrifying example of a willingness to use extreme violence against an entire population deemed racially inferior.
So it set a precedent.
A dark precedent, yes, unfortunately. Then World War I comes along and acts as another powerful catalyst.
How so?
It dramatically intensified nationalist and racist sentiments across Europe. Germany's devastating defeat, the territorial losses. It created this widespread resentment.
And that led to the stab-in-the-back myth.
Exactly. The insidious myth blaming socialists and, crucially, Jews for Germany's loss. Falsely, of course, but it gained significant traction.
That narrative of finding a scapegoat in crisis, it keeps coming up.
It's a recurring and dangerous pattern, yeah. And it's from this incredibly volatile environment, post-WWI, that the Nazi Party emerges.
And their core ideology sounds absolutely fundamental to understanding the Holocaust's origins.
It was the bedrock. I mean, from their very beginnings, the Nazis envisioned a world completely without Jews. They saw them as a fundamentally corrupting influence, the embodiment of everything that was wrong with modernity, as they put it.
Wow.
Their concept of the German nation wasn't just about physical borders. It was this mystical racial community, the Volksgemeinschaft, that they believed needed purging. purging of anything racially foreign or socially deficient.
And Hitler himself. This obsession with reversing the WWI losses, gaining Lebensraum, living space in Eastern Europe, that was central too, wasn't it?
Absolutely central. This aggressive ambition to colonize Eastern Europe was inextricably linked to their racist ideology. They saw Slavic peoples as inferior, the lands to the east as ripe for German settlement.
And they tied this into fears of the Soviet Union.
Skillfully exploited those fears, yes. Hitler wove this elaborate, completely false conspiracy theory that Jews secretly controlled both the Soviet Union and the Western powers, all plotting Germany's destruction, supposedly.
So it's this terrifying combination: extreme racial hatred, aggressive expansionism, and paranoid conspiracy theories.
A potent and terrifying mix, absolutely, fueling their entire agenda.
Okay, so that paints a picture of the deeply troubling context. Let's turn to the rise of the Nazi Party itself. Despite these extreme views, they actually gained significant popular support during the Depression.
They did, campaigning aggressively on anti-communism, promising swift economic recovery, playing on people's fears and desperation.
And then, January 1933, Hitler is appointed chancellor, and things deteriorate fast.
Alarmingly fast. Within mere months, the Nazi regime moves swiftly. They dismantle all other political parties, seize control of the media, start systematically arresting political opponents, especially communists.
And the first concentration camps are established then.
Yes, initially for extrajudicial imprisonment of these perceived enemies. But their repression wasn't just political. It quickly expanded.
Who else did they target?
Other groups they deemed outside their narrow definition of the national community: Roma and Sinti people, homosexual men, individuals they labeled work-shy or asocial.
And it wasn't just imprisonment. There was that horrifying forced sterilization program, too.
Yes, targeting people deemed to have hereditary illnesses. An estimated 400,000 individuals forcibly sterilized. Forced abortions, too. It's brutal.
So they're consolidating power, targeting specific groups. How did the general German population react?
Well, that's key. While the Nazis aimed for total control, their most direct, brutal repression in these early years was primarily focused on those target groups. The majority of Germans who didn't actively oppose the regime, initially, they had relatively little to fear directly.
Which helped the Nazis consolidate power.
It was a crucial factor, yes. And they certainly built popular support through, well, apparent economic growth largely fueled by massive rearmament.
And the foreign policy successes, annexing Austria, the Sudetenland.
Exactly. Those annexations seemed to legitimize the regime in the eyes of many Germans. All the while, that relentless anti-Jewish propaganda machine was working overtime.
A constant barrage, you said.
Constant and pervasive. Newspapers, radio, films, even children's books. Systematically dehumanizing Jewish people.
But the actual violence against Jews within Germany before the war, what did that look like?
33 to 39, the overt anti-Jewish violence inside Germany was mostly non-lethal. You saw locally organized boycotts of Jewish businesses, vandalism of Jewish-owned stores, particularly in rural areas.
Small towns declaring themselves free of Jews.
Tragically, yes.
Yeah.
Due to this intense pressure, and a significant number of Jewish businesses, maybe a third, were forced to close.
But the violence got worse in the annexed areas.
Much worse. And then, November 1938, you have Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass.
That was a major turning point.
Absolutely. A nationwide pogrom. State-sponsored terror on an unprecedented scale. Over 7,500 Jewish shops looted. More than 1,000 synagogues damaged or destroyed.
And people were killed?
At least 90 Jews murdered outright. Up to 30,000 Jewish men arrested, sent to concentration camps.
Horrific.
And then, to add insult to injury, the German Jewish community was collectively fined over 1 billion Reichsmarks, a punitive tax.
The message couldn't have been clearer.
Brutally clear. The Nazi regime intended to force all Jews to leave Germany. Get out.
And following Kristallnacht, emigration surged.
It did. Between 33 and 39, maybe around 250,000 Jews left Germany and Austria, but it wasn't a simple escape. Very few countries were willing to ease their strict immigration restrictions. Getting visas, travel documents, it was incredibly difficult, often impossible.
So who was left behind?
By the end of 1939, mostly those who couldn't immigrate: the elderly, the poor, women, disproportionately. Those with means and connections had mostly gotten out if they could.
Where did they go, the ones who left?
Major destinations included the USA, Mandatory Palestine, the UK, Argentina, even places like Shanghai, South America, some back to Eastern Europe even.
And the Nazis profited from this.
Perversely, yes. They collected nearly 1 billion Reichsmarks in immigration taxes, mostly from the Jews themselves. Cynical and cruel. And this policy of forced emigration continued into 1940.
So by the time World War II begins, the situation for Jews in Germany is already dire. But the war itself, that provided cover for even worse things.
It did. One of the first major escalations under the cloak of war was Action T4.
What was that?
The systematic murder of around 70,000 institutionalized Germans with disabilities. This included all the institutionalized Jewish individuals, maybe 4,000, 5,000 people. They used poison gas in specialized killing centers.
Gas chambers already.
Yes. And what's particularly chilling is that despite attempts at secrecy, word leaked out. Hitler actually halted the centralized program in August 41 due to public unease.
But the killing didn't stop.
No, it continued decentralized. Denial of care, starvation, poisoning, another maybe 120,000 deaths by the war's end.
And the personnel and technology from T4?
Horrifically, yes. Many of the personnel, the expertise, the gas technology developed for Action T4 were later directly applied to the mass murder of Jews. A direct, chilling link.
That connection is terrifying. Then, June 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa.
A major turning point. While there were strategic reasons, Hitler viewed it ideologically. An apocalyptic battle against Jewish Bolshevism.
So conceived as a war of extermination from the start.
Absolutely. Complete disregard for laws of war, human decency. They envisioned a swift victory, then radical demographic restructuring, removing maybe 31 million people to make way for German settlers.
How did they plan to manage that?
Logistically.
Oh.
Feed the army by looting occupied territories. Export food back to Germany. Policies designed deliberately to cause mass starvation in Soviet cities and, of course, in the Jewish ghettos.
Did the starvation policy work as they intended?
Not always as efficiently as they planned, but yes, it caused millions of deaths. In Ukraine, besieged Leningrad, the ghettos, a man-made famine.
And right behind the army came the Einsatzgruppen?
The mobile killing squads.
Yeah.
Yes. Their actions marked a horrifying new phase of systematic murder.
What did they do?
Systematically murdered Jews and other perceived enemies in the newly occupied Soviet territories. Mass shootings became widespread, routine.
How were these carried out?
Brutally efficient. Victims rounded up, marched to pre-dug pits, forced to undress, shot often in the back and the neck, buried in mass graves, sometimes while still alive.
In public?
Often, yes. And their property looted by the occupiers and sometimes locals.
And ghettos were established in these areas too?
Around 200 ghettos in the occupied Soviet Union. Many were short-lived, their inhabitants quickly executed. Larger ones, Vilna, Kovno, Riga, Białystok, Lwów, lasted longer as forced labor centers, but conditions were absolutely brutal.
The cruelty is just staggering.
It is. And tragically, widespread rape and sexual exploitation of both Jewish and non-Jewish women became commonplace. A horrific feature of the occupation, underscoring the complete dehumanization.
By this point, late 1941, had Hitler given the order for the final solution, the complete annihilation?
Most historians agree, yes, an explicit order to kill all Jews in Europe. The most likely timing is around December 1941.
Is there specific evidence?
Hitler's statement on December 12, 1941, after declaring war on the U.S. is pretty chilling. The world war is here. The annihilation of the Jews must be the necessary consequence.
Leaves little doubt.
Very little. And then, January 1942, you have the Wannsee Conference.
What was the purpose of that meeting?
Essentially bureaucratic coordination. Top officials meeting to coordinate the implementation of this policy of systematic extermination across the entire continent, streamlining the killing machine.
And 1942 becomes the peak year for the killings.
Tragically, yes. The majority of Holocaust murders occurred in 1942. Over 3 million Jewish people murdered in that single year alone.
3 million in 1 year.
Industrialized slaughter on an unprecedented scale. Terrifying efficiency.
Which leads us to maybe the most chilling aspect, the systematic deportations and the purpose-built extermination camps.
Starting in 1942, yes, Jews from all over Nazi-occupied Europe were systematically rounded up, deported to these camps.
Where were they located?
Strategically placed along major railway lines for transport efficiency, but deliberately in remote areas to try and avoid public notice. Though the stench from the mass killings was often noticeable for miles.
The deportations themselves, what were conditions like?
Appalling. People crammed into cattle cars, 100, 150 maybe in one car. No food, water, sanitation, ventilation. For days. Death rates on the journey were incredibly high.
And arrival at the camps?
A descent into absolute hell. Immediately stripped of any remaining possessions, forced to undress, hair shaved off, herded into the gas chambers.
The gas. Zyklon B.
Often Zyklon B, yes. Death was agonizing, could take up to 30 minutes. The chambers were often primitive, sometimes malfunctioned, leading to shootings instead.
Auschwitz-Birkenau was the largest. Was everyone gassed immediately on arrival?
Not quite everyone at Auschwitz.
Right.
Maybe 20–25% were selected for forced labor initially. The vast majority went straight to their deaths. But even those selected for labor, starvation, brutality experiments, most died quickly anyway.
The scale, the cold efficiency, it's almost impossible to grasp. And these camps, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, they actually generated revenue.
Incredibly, yes. From possessions stolen from the victims, gold fillings, clothes, valuables. Estimates suggest those 3 camps alone generated nearly 179 million Reichsmarks. It highlights the cold, bureaucratic, avaricious nature of it all. And these camps were run by shockingly small staffs. A few thousand Jewish prisoners forced to help, about 1,000 Tronniki auxiliaries, mostly Ukrainian, and relatively few German SS guards.
Half of all Holocaust deaths were by gas?
Roughly half, yes, in these dedicated extermination camps. And thousands of Roma and Sinti people were also murdered there.
Were there any acts of resistance in these camps?
There were acts of incredible bravery. Prisoner uprisings at Treblinka and Sobibor actually led to the earlier closure of those 2 camps.
The deportations from Western and Central Europe, were they organized differently?
Somewhat, still centrally directed from Berlin, but implementation involved more negotiation with Allied or occupied governments. They had to consider public reaction more.
Okay.
Initially, in parts of the East, local Nazis sometimes massacred local Jews just to make space for deportees. At Auschwitz, initially deportees were registered, but from July 42, those selections on arrival, sending most straight to the gas, became standard.
And in Western Europe, local police were often involved in the arrests.
Often heavily involved, yes. Collaboration varied, but local police carrying out roundups was common. This significantly impacted the scale of deportations.
So 1942 saw huge numbers deported from places like France, Belgium, the Netherlands.
Nearly 100,000 just from those 3 countries in 1942 alone. Interestingly, the death rate from France was comparatively lower, around 25%.
Why was that?
Partly because many deportees were non-citizens, recent immigrants. Also, various acts of resistance, like hiding Jews even in the Grand Mosque of Paris, remarkably.
And the Netherlands had a higher death rate.
Considerably higher, yes. Possibly harder to hide their flat, densely populated country. And perhaps greater collaboration by Dutch police. It's complex.
It really underscores that this wasn't just the Nazis acting alone. Many perpetrators, many collaborators.
Absolutely crucial point. Non-Germans were involved at many levels.
Yeah.
Dutch, French, Polish police, Romanian soldiers, foreign SS auxiliaries, Ukrainian partisans, even some ordinary civilians.
Motivations varied.
Widely. Some coerced, sure. Others motivated by personal gain, ideology, antisemitism, promise of better treatment. Even, disturbingly, for entertainment. Gerlach estimates non-Germans not under direct German command were responsible for maybe 5–6% of deaths, but their involvement was crucial in many other ways.
And millions benefited from the genocide.
Directly or indirectly, yes. Millions across Europe profited. Corruption was rampant within the SS, despite rules about stolen property belonging to the state. German agencies competed for loot.
How did ordinary people benefit?
Non-Jewish workers got jobs and housing vacated by murdered Jews. Businessmen eliminated competitors, took over businesses cheaply. People moved into Jewish homes, took their possessions. Near the camps, some locals searched remains for valuables.
And Germany's allies took property too.
Yes, Vichy France, Norway, others. And post-war, Swiss banks became notorious for holding Nazi gold and unclaimed victim deposits. Even modern companies, Bayer, BMW, Volkswagen, benefited from forced labor.
Right, let's talk more about forced labor. It wasn't just immediate death for everyone.
No. From 1938 onwards, escalating during the war, many Jews were drafted into forced labor camps, work details. Initially, maybe overseen by civilian authorities, conditions harsh, but not instantly lethal on a mass scale.
But that changed after the invasion of the Soviet Union.
Drastically worsened after mid-1941. Death rates, sword starvation, disease, brutality, murder. Private companies subjected workers to murderous conditions.
And the selections happened there too. Fit for work versus killed.
Often, yes. From 1941 onwards, those capable of hard labor were separated, others usually killed. Skilled workers might survive slightly longer, but most jobs were non-skilled, easily replaceable.
And Jewish laborers were treated worse than others.
Generally, yes. Far worse conditions, higher mortality rates than non-Jewish prisoners or forced laborers.
Then Himmler wanted all Jewish labor under SS control by mid-43.
Exactly, bringing them into the concentration camp system proper. Some labor camps became concentration camps, like Kovno. Others were dissolved, prisoners sent to concentration camps.
How many survived in the camps?
Despite the immense death toll, maybe up to 200,000 Jews survived the war within the concentration camp system. It's why the image of the camps is such a powerful symbol, even though most victims actually died elsewhere, extermination camps, shootings.
And millions of other non-Jewish forced laborers suffered terribly too.
Absolutely. Soviets, Poles especially.
Yep.
Inadequate food, medical care, abuse. Hundreds of thousands died. And some German allies, like Slovakia and Hungary, deported Jews partly to avoid sending their own people for forced labor.
And the horrific sexual slavery.
Yes, the Lepanka roundups. East European women kidnapped, forced into military and camp brothels, despite rules against fraternization. Just brutal exploitation.
Okay, let's pause here for a moment. We're covering some incredibly heavy but vital history today on Tell Me More Stories Told Us podcast. If you're finding this deep dive insightful and want to ensure you don't miss future explorations into crucial historical events, please take a second to hit that subscribe button wherever you're listening. It really helps us continue bringing these stories to light.
Definitely. Every bit of support helps.
All right, so the international community, they weren't entirely ignorant of what was happening.
No, the Nazi leaders knew their actions would draw condemnation. As early as June 42, the BBC broadcast reports of 700,000 Jews killed in Poland based on info from the Polish government in exile.
And the Allies issued a declaration.
December 1942, yes. The Allies, the United Nations, as they were forming, jointly declared condemnation of the systematic murder of Jews. But most neutral countries maintained pro-German policies, though some did offer refuge, with varying success.
What about direct Allied action? Bombing the camps or the railways?
It's a deeply debated point. There was no detailed Allied photo intelligence study of the major camps during the war. Appeals to bomb rail lines or crematoria were rejected, often with little input from war departments.
Would it have made a difference?
Historians still argue about that.
Yeah.
It's complex. Would it have saved lives, slowed the killing, diverted resources? We can't know for sure, but the lack of action is heavily scrutinized.
And the killing continued relentlessly, even late in the war. Hungary in 1944.
The largest single murder action after 1942. After Germany invaded Hungary in March 44, the Hungarian government cooperated in deporting 437,000 Jews in just 8 weeks, mostly to Auschwitz.
Why did the Hungarian government cooperate so readily then?
Intense German pressure, certainly. But also, expropriating Jewish property served Hungarian economic goals. And deporting Jews meant they didn't have to send non-Jewish Hungarians for forced labor in the Reich.
Survivors of selection were forced into war production.
Yes, construction, manufacturing, fighter aircraft production. It's a grim irony the Nazis had largely made Germany Jew-free by 43, then reversed it by importing Hungarian Jews for slave labor in 44.
And then, as the Allies advanced, the death marches began.
Mid-1944 onwards, yes. From the Baltics first as the Red Army advanced, SS evacuated concentration camp prisoners westward.
What were these marches like?
Hundreds of miles on foot or crammed into open rail cars, little or no food, water, shelter. The weak, the sick, anyone who couldn't keep up was shot by the guards. Brutal.
Why evacuate them?
To keep using them as labor further inside Germany, Austria. And crucially, to prevent them falling into enemy hands, revealing the truth.
These marches caused even more deaths.
Catastrophic breakdown of supplies in remaining camps. Starvation, disease soared. While not a specific policy to kill all Jews on the marches, estimates suggest 70,000 to 100,000 Jews died during these evacuations in the final months.
Where did the survivors end up?
Often in other concentration camps, later liberated by Allies in 45. Liberators found scenes of unimaginable horror, mass graves. It's important to recall the deadliest phase overall was Operation Reinhard 42-43. About 2 million Jews murdered in Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka.
And the fastest rate of killing.
That period from late July to early November 1942, maybe 1.47 million Jews murdered in just 100 days. Unprecedented speed. Over 3 million killed in 1942 alone.
And that specific massacre at Majdanek.
November 3rd, 1943. Around 18,400 Jews murdered in just 9 hours. Largest single-day toll in a death camp. Part of Operation Harvest Festival, maybe 43,000 Jews killed over 2 days. Largest single massacre by German forces.
And we must remember, alongside the Jews, millions of other civilians and POWs were murdered by the Nazis.
Absolutely. Estimates range, but maybe 6 to 8 million non-Jewish civilians and POWs, perhaps more. The scale of Nazi criminality was vast. In some countries like Hungary, Jews were the majority of civilian deaths. In Poland, majority or half. But in the USSR, France, Greece, Yugoslavia, non-Jewish losses were higher.
The aftermath. Liberation wasn't the end of the suffering, was it?
Far from it. Survivors tried to return home, but finding relatives was rare. Recovering property was difficult, often met with hostility. Violent attacks, like the Kielce pogrom in Poland, convinced many leaving Eastern Europe as the only option.
Anti-Semitism actually increased in some places after the war?
Tragically, yes.
Yeah.
Partly due to property disputes. By war's end, fewer than 28,000 German Jews remained in Germany. That number grew to 250,000 by 47, mainly due to refugees from the East filling displaced persons camps.
The DP camps.
Jews were about 25% of the DP camp population. Despite poor health, survivors organized self-government, education, rehabilitation. Incredible resilience.
But leaving the camps was hard.
Many countries were still reluctant to accept immigrants. So many stayed in German GP camps until Israel's establishment in 1948. Others went to the U.S. around 1950 when restrictions eased slightly.
And justice for the perpetrators?
The vast majority were never tried. Post-war purges of collaborators happened, but often didn't focus on crimes against Jews.
The Nuremberg trials.
Tried 23 top leaders, 45-46. Primarily for wars of aggression, but the systematic murder of Jews became central, though many Germans saw these Allied trials as victor's justice.
Did Germany pursue justice later?
West Germany investigated about 100,000 people, but only tried around 6,000, mostly low-level perpetrators. The Eichmann trial in Israel in 1961 was significant, relying heavily on survivor testimony, which was controversial but powerful.
What about reparations for the immense material losses?
Estimated around $10 billion in 1944, dollars maybe $180 billion today, not including forced labor value. Efforts began post-war, another wave in the 1990s after communism fell.
Did Germany pay reparations?
Yes, significantly. Between 1945 and 2018, estimated $86.8 billion in restitution and compensation. Landmark agreement with Israel and the Claims Conference in 1952. Pensions, other reparations continue.
And other countries.
Some restitution, but many programs fell short, especially for property. Western countries restored some, communist countries often nationalized formerly Jewish assets. Poland is the only EU member without comprehensive restitution laws for private property from that era.
How has the memory of the Holocaust evolved?
For decades after the war, it was largely confined to survivor communities. It really entered mainstream Western consciousness in the 1990s, becoming a symbol of ultimate evil.
Holocaust education became widespread.
Yes, argued to promote citizenship, reduce prejudice, International Holocaust Remembrance Day on Jan 27th, memorials, museums, culture.
But denial still exists.
Yes, it's a crime in some countries, but still promoted by some individuals, even governments. And the question of drawing lessons, redemptive meaning, that's still debated.
How did memory differ in communist countries?
They often marginalized the specific anti-Semitic persecution, downplayed national collaboration. Some of that persists post-communism. West Germany developed a more self-critical memory from the 70s, 80s, which spread in Western Europe and influenced the EU's human rights focus.
And in the U.S.?
Memory tends to be more abstract, universalized. Dangers of prejudice in general. Interestingly, during apartheid South Africa, it was evoked in very divergent ways.
Does Holocaust memory always promote human rights?
That's debated. Some argue its memory has been used in Israel, for instance, to justify force in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's complex.
But it remains the most well-known genocide.
By far. Most infamous in European history, most documented, studied, the archetype in genocide studies. Massive scholarly literature exists.
Yet people still see it as unique, incomprehensible.
That tendency persists publicly, yes. Historians largely reject incomprehensibility, emphasizing context. But the uniqueness argument often centers on that industrial killing, state-ordered bureaucratic in a civilized society.
Did it emerge from Western civilization, or was it an aberration?
A huge ongoing debate among historians. Where does this darkness come from?
And finally, the Jewish population today.
Remarkably, it's nearing pre-Holocaust numbers, around 15.2 million globally as of April 2022, a testament to resilience.
This deep dive, it really reveals a chillingly systematic, horrific chapter in human history. The scale of suffering, the motivations. It's a stark reminder, isn't it? Dangers of unchecked hatred, ideological extremism.
Absolutely.
And that initial focus on forced emigration before the descent into mass murder. It highlights that terrifying gradual escalation.
It didn't happen overnight.
No. We really encourage everyone listening to continue exploring this complex history, grapple with its difficult truths, consider its profound implications for our world today. Understanding the past is just so crucial in building a future free from such atrocities. This has been Tell Me More Stories Told as podcast. If you found this exploration insightful, please do hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our upcoming deep dives into other fascinating and sometimes difficult stories from history. We have many more waiting for you.